Hi, I'm Mark Madison, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service historian stationed at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And I want to welcome you all very warmly to a virtual edition of our Conservationists in Action discussion series. We bring usually into our studio today, because of COVID, into our homes, famous authors, scientists, historians, filmmakers, into our studio or virtually to discuss conservation issues. And today we have a real treat in that we have Jeffrey Ryan with us. And before I introduce Jeffrey, I'd like to just give a little programming note. So we're going to talk with Jeffrey, get some background on other films he's made and books he's written. And then at 7 p.m., we're going to see his brand new film about Howard Zahniser, the author of the Wilderness Act. So that'll happen at 7. Or for the next 40 minutes or so, we'll get some background on all of the conservation work that Jeffrey's done. And then once again at 7, we'll show this brand new film. So let me tell you a little about Jeffrey Ryan, who's been kind enough to join us this evening. Maine-based author, filmmaker, and speaker, Jeffrey Ryan has a passion for exploring the outdoors on foot and along the paths of history. His travels on thousands of miles, both in America's most famous and some of the lesser known trails, have inspired several books, including Appalachian Odyssey, a 28-year hike on America's trail, and his 2019 historical novel entitled Hermit, The Mysterious Life of Jim Whyte. Ryan's interest in the history of America's conservation movement led him to create a video series entitled Voices of the Wilderness, in hopes of keeping the enormous contributions of those who've advocated for the creation and protection of our wildlands in the public eye. When he's not researching, writing, and hiking, he can be found exploring the backroads of the USA and Canada in his vintage 1985 Volkswagen camper. So, Jeffrey, it's a real pleasure to have you back. Thank you so much for agreeing to rejoin us on Conservationists in Action.
Thanks for having me, Mark. It's great to be back.
I wish we could do it in person, but this is the next best thing. So, Jeffrey, the first question, which ties right into our later film this evening, is what is Voices of the Wilderness?
Voices of the Wilderness is the natural sort of outgrowth of some of the work I've done in my previous books. And I'd been playing around with the idea of doing something, some kind of book or series related to the people who were behind the Wilderness Act and the Wilderness Society and other conservation efforts. And as you mentioned, I do a lot of traveling, and I was having a bit of a conundrum about what form this would all take when I decided I'd go where I usually go to figure things out, which is on top of a mountain. In this case, it was on a ridge up in Maryland. And somebody I met on this ridge happened to know you and steered me in your direction.
Uh-oh.
And the next thing I knew, I was at the Conservation Training Center pouring through some wonderful materials that you have. And it sort of grew into a film at that point, a series of films.
Yeah, indeed. The film tonight is the second in the series, my understanding is, and I think the first one was Aldo Leopold and the Birth of the Land Ethic. Tell us a little about your interest in Mr. Leopold.
Well, that started with I started looking into Benton Mackay, who was the the guy who came up with the idea for the Appalachian Trail, ended up being one of the 8 founders of the Wilderness Society. And so I started sort of digging into who were these gentlemen that founded the Wilderness Society in addition to Mackay. And I had known about Leopold before. Um, if you dig not very far into conservation as a subject, you will find Aldo pretty close to the top. And so I started researching him more and more, and I was in my van and decided to go out and see his birthplace in Burlington, Iowa, on the banks of the Mississippi River. And then I went up to Wisconsin to the Leopold Center and interviewed Buddy Huffaker and his staff up there, Kurt Miney, the biographer of Leopold, and some others. And he's just such a fascinating guy because he single-handedly really started 4 major movements in conservation in his lifetime. The first being the establishment of the first wilderness area in the world, I believe, in New Mexico in the 1920s. The second was he wrote a book on game management when that was basically he came up with the concept of game management, and then he moved on to watershed restoration. These were all things that nobody had really touched before. It was all Leopold's genius. And finally, the birth of the land ethic, which he came to the conclusion that public lands were only part of the equation to having a healthy earth, that the best thing we can do individually is to live on a piece of land, as he said, without spoiling it. So all 4 of those things were so amazing to unwrap for me, and I made a film about that. It was quite fun.
Yeah, Leopold, I think, is somebody who's still pretty well remembered and a very logical choice for something called Voices of the Wilderness, concerning his role in setting up really the nation's first wilderness in Gila. Howard Zahniser, the subject of your second film, which will be screening at 7 Eastern time this evening, is probably not as well known. How did you become interested in Zani?
Well, actually, that was part of my work at the Conservation Training Center. I started digging through the files, and you had quite a bit on Zani, and started looking into it and thought it's really interesting that he became sort of the handoff person, the person who took the baton from the founders of the Wilderness Society, who were, for various reasons, as we'll see in the film, were unable or uh, unwilling in some cases because they were busy with other projects to take on the leadership role. And Zani was originally hired to be a more of the editorial director and morphed into um, the de facto leader, really, and was responsible for single-handedly creating and making sure that the Wilderness Act got passed in 1964. Like so many others that we all know and love in the conservation movement, it's really interesting how so many unfortunately died young. Bob Marshall, um, Leopold, Zahniser, they gave it their all, and we're fortunate that they did.
Yeah, very inspiring, and this is the first film I've seen on Zahniser, so I think you're in virgin territory here. All of these guys need more films and more awareness. And one of the great things about your work is you're a really excellent communicator, Jeffrey. It really comes
Thank you.
through. Now, I mentioned before we have authors, filmmakers, and historians on this series. You're actually all 3. So this counts as 3 of the conservationists in action. And we wanted to go out with a bang with the virtual thing. The first book of yours I read was actually the Appalachian Odyssey, a 28-year hike on America's Trail. And I think anybody, including me, when you look at the title, the obvious question is, why did it take 28 years?
Well, I had actually gone on one long distance hike before. I did a 6-month stint on the Pacific Crest Trail in my 20s and mid 20s, and like many other people of that age bracket, you end up going to work, and it's not easy to get a big chunk of time. So in 1985, on this very day of this photograph here, that is me in the red shirt on the right of the photograph, and the guy with his hands on his hips is my friend Wayne. And we went for a hike up to the summit of Katahdin, which is the northern terminus of the trail. And we had, as I said in the book, we had no idea at the time that this was actually starting a 28-year tradition of doing a piece of the trail every year. And it really took us a couple of years before we realized that we were doing it. It was Wayne who said when we were doing a portion of the Long Trail in Vermont that you do realize that we've started doing the AT. And I burst out laughing and said, "You've got to be kidding, man. It would take us 30 years at this rate." And he said, "So what?" And truer words have never been spoken. And we just kept on going in non-linear fashion. We just picked out a different section every year and jumped on, and scheduling allowed us to take anywhere between a week and 2 weeks, and that's what we did. And we hit all sorts of different weather. This is peak foliage with first snowfall up in Maine one year. And it was just a great way to do the trail. And I wrote the book about it, which is basically 28 short stories. Each trip had its own flavor to it. And in the midst of doing that, here we are as hearty and hale old men finishing up 20 years later, 28 years. And, when I was writing the book, I got more and more intrigued with the story of how the trail took shape in the first place, which was a natural progression for me. An old mentor of mine once said, trails don't just happen. And I always remembered that. Somebody has to come up with the idea, whether it's a 1 mile urban trail or a 2,000-mile 14-state trail. And so I started digging into that, and that brought me to the second book, which is Blazing Ahead, Benton MacKaye, Myron Avery, and the Rivalry that built the Appalachian Trail.
Let me ask you a couple questions about the AT, because we actually have some people tuning in that work in various aspects of the Appalachian Trail, including Linda Patton, who's at the who's a librarian at the Research Library of the Appalachian Trail Museum. And so why is the AT important to American conservation?
It's boy, for a variety of reasons, it's important. First of all, it was really the first multi-state trail envisioned at all. The first trail, really the first long distance trail, was the Long Trail in Vermont, which dates back to about 1910. But when MacKaye came up with the idea for the AT, part of the um, idea behind it, in fact, the driving idea behind it, was a place to escape from the pressures of everyday life. In MacKaye's words, he said, "We need a place to recreate and oxygenate." And for the 1920s, early 1920s, we don't often think of really needing that kind of place to escape, but he was very prescient that way. And that was a really important aspect of conservation. But the second part was the actual federation of clubs that came together to construct the trail, which was a different kind of conservation. So they needed to procure the land, in some cases procure easements, and knit together this federation of clubs to protect the resource. And as we know, as the story unfolds, there were a number of threats to the AT. In fact, Skyline Drive was built over the top of it. And so they needed to be able to adjust to forces from the outside encroaching on the trail itself. And I think that's really important too, is that they were able to figure out a way that even in a relatively urban part of the United States to keep the trail sacrosanct. And it set the stage for a number of other national scenic trails.
Did you have a favorite stretch, Jeffrey, of the Appalachian Trail?
Boy, that one's tough. It's like which is your favorite child? But I really enjoy the 100-mile wilderness up in Maine for various reasons. One is it's my home state, but it's really the most remote section of the trail. But I also found that I really loved southwestern Virginia quite a bit, and of course the Smokies are pretty special too.
You're a man of extremes, Jeffrey. In addition to hiking all over the place, from the Pacific Crest Trail to the Appalachian Trail and many smaller trails in between, you also like to travel, we've been told, by VW camper. Tell us why you prefer that mode of travel.
It's wonderful. It's fairly reliable, given the fact that it's 35 years old. But it's a really great it's a way to travel for me. It's my office, my bedroom, my kitchen on wheels, and so it's sort of to me like hiking on wheels in a number of ways. I can just hit a campsite and be away from it all and do some writing, or I can be heading off to a book signing or other type of thing related, or doing research, other things related to my writing. So it's really the ideal vehicle. Since that photo was taken, I put a solar panel on the top, and I have a refrigerator freezer powered by the sun in the back. So it really is pretty nimble and pretty comfortable. A great way to go. It's not the best in the snow, but it will suffice as long as it doesn't stick on the ground too long.
Well, one thing you need in there, Jeffrey, is a bookshelf to hold your growing collection of books. One of the books you alluded to uh, earlier was Blazing Ahead, Benton MacKaye, Myron Avery, and the rivalry that built the Appalachian Trail. And uh, a lot of people do know Benton MacKaye. Uh, Fewer people know Myron Avery. So could you give us a brief sketch of these two folks who developed a rather extreme rivalry?
Yes, actually, it's really not surprising when you think of their personality traits, because Mackay was a planner. He was a great idea man, um, and visionary. And Myron Avery was a roll up your sleeves and get it done guy. Myron's on the right there in the white shirt. And um, Avery basically single handedly took on the construction of the trail. He oversaw every bit of it. Actually, he was the first 2,000-mile hiker. He was so fastidious that he took a bicycle wheel with him that was calibrated to the tenth of a mile, and he'd roll it in front of him and write and take notes all the time. So he was basically writing the guidebook. He was a great multitasker. So as he was determining where the trail would go, he was actually writing the guidebook at the same time. And as I mentioned, he did 2,000 miles. Was solely responsible for pushing the trail from the original southern destination of Tennessee down to Springer Mountain in Georgia, and from Mount Washington in New Hampshire all the way up to Katahdin, which added another 250 plus miles to the trail on that end. Um, he was a very tough personality to get along with. He sort of had that Steve Jobs personality of, this is where we're going, and if you're not on board, see you later. And so that caused a rift with Mackay. And it really came to a head, as I mentioned Skyline Drive earlier. Mackay was really, really thrown by the fact that automobiles would basically be driving over the trail that they had so carefully laid out. And Avery's response was, that's okay, we'll just get the Park Service to move the trail over a little bit. And it actually caused a rift and a back and forth, a power struggle, if you will, between them, the father of the trail and the upstart builder of the trail. And in 1934, it came to a head, and they never spoke to each other again after that. So Mackay split off from the AT movement and became one of the founders of the Wilderness Society. So there was a good result for both of them. Um, Interestingly enough, part of the reason why Mackay felt strongly about starting the Wilderness Society was the threat of automobiles to wilderness areas. So he and a couple of others, including Bob Marshall, sat down and reached out to other people they knew, and that really created the founding 8 of the Wilderness Society.
I like how incestuous it is. It all ties back to the Wilderness Society and the same small cadre of conservationists making a difference in the 30s and 40s. Jeffrey, let me pull away and just do a shameless plug here. I
Please
just want to
do.
remind people we are going to be showing your new film, Howard Zahniser, Champion for the Wilderness, at 7 o'clock. Also, one of the good parts about these online Facebook Live conservationists in action is we can reach people all over the country. We have our friend Larry Batson, who's tuned in from Indiana. Larry's got a radio show, and he's been a longtime wildlife protector. We have a couple librarians, including one that used to work here, Ann Post Pool, and we already mentioned Linda. And I just like to let folks know if they have a question for Jeffrey about the Appalachian Trail, about Volkswagen campers, about whatever, please feel free to put them in the comments and we'll get to them either this hour or the next hour. Let me move on to your next up, which was a little bit of a change of pace, but I can't imagine anybody reading the title who wouldn't be intrigued by that. And that's Hermit, The Mysterious Life of Jim Whyte. And tell us a little about why Mr. Whyte is so mysterious and how this book is different than your other books.
Well, first of all, it should come as no surprise because you see all these threads that seem to connect. Um, I was working on Blazing Ahead and in a Portland office building, and a gentleman walked in and to vacuum the building one night and asked me what I was doing there working so late all the time. And I told him I was working on a book about the Appalachian Trail or Appalachian, depending on how far south you are. And his eyes just lit up and he said, "Oh my gosh, have I got something for you?" And he came back the following week with a book that he found at a yard sale written by Myron Avery in 1934. And it was a guide to the Appalachian Trail in Maine. And in it, on page 34, Avery mentioned that he had cut a blue blaze side trail outside of Monson to a hermit's cabin. And the hermit's name was Jim Whyte. And he was this notorious guy from up in Monson. And rumor had it that not only was he filthy rich, but he had made his fortune by illicit means. And so that intrigued me, and I started looking into it. And in fact, this character was so intriguing, I couldn't believe no one had written about him before. This is him in 1914 up by a cabin he built with his wife, Tessa, who's sitting on the porch there. And Whyte had made a fortune. He had run away from home at age 16 in New York City, joined the German Navy in the 1870s, disappeared for 17 years and came back the equivalent of a multimillionaire, and then ran up to Maine to build this cabin and hide. When World War I broke out, he lost his fortune because he invested in German shipping. Not a good place to put your money back then. And so he lost all his money, and his wife left him, and he was broke, and he's living up in this cabin, and somehow he became a multimillionaire again. And all I'll say is he set up a smuggling operation using the trains and some connections that he had made in New York City. And that was the basis of my book. Phenomenal story.
Now, is this book a history or a novel or a hybrid of the two?
It's a hybrid of the two. It's about I like to say it's about 83% factual from what I was able to dig up. but I had to make up a few characters to weave the story together cohesively because there were a lot of significant gaps in his life that without inventing some good old Maine characters, I don't think it would have held together. So it's a historical novel, a little bit different for
And the
me.
most important, yeah, that's what I thought. The most important question, Jeffrey, is did Mr. Whyte really scratch a deer's ear?
He in fact did. He good pickup there. He took a 10-foot fly rod and stuck it out through a hole in his kitchen wall, which was also a way for him to look out and make sure that people weren't coming to find out what he was up to. But I read this in at least two places. He stuck a fly rod out through the wall and tickled a deer's ear on occasion for entertainment. He had an apple tree right
Uh,
outside the door.
they don't make hermits like Mr. Whyte anymore.
No.
Let me ask you about one more book that's also a departure, in that it's a West Coast book, and we've talked largely about Maine and East Coast characters, and that's your book Blast, My Return to St. Helens, which is an interesting book in that it's both a hiking book and an environmental history book. So tell us a little about that kind of cool ecological story you told.
Well, it was a really neat experience for me because when I was hiking on the Pacific Crest Trail in 1983, I came to this meadow in southern Washington and literally had a jaw-dropping moment and a pack dropping moment. I took my pack off and sat on it, and I was stunned by what I was looking at, which was in fact on the left side. I saw the hulk of St. Helens covered in ash. It blown up 3 years prior, um, which interestingly enough, it blew up the day I graduated from college. Um, so I was kind of destined to go there again. So I had St. Helens on the left, I had Rainier in the center, and I had Adams on the right. And at the time, I didn't know this, but 3 years later in 86, I'd go back and I would climb all three of those peaks in a 12-day period. I was in shape back then from playing soccer. But anyway, um, I climbed it the first time and then I went back. I had the movie out of St. Helens in 2018, and I realized it was coming up on the 30th year anniversary of the climb. I guess it was 89 when we went, and not 86. So anyway, I was looking at these films and thought, oh my gosh, it's the 30th anniversary of the St. Helens climb. So I got in touch with the guys that had climbed it with me the first time, and we went back and did it again. And the difference in 30 years of the landscape and it was just phenomenal how Mother Nature has come back from basically being buried in tons of ash. And as you can see, some of the remnants of the blast still remain, like the stripped down trees here standing up above, but you can see the younger growth coming in and taking over. And I wanted to get there while the transition was still as visible as it is. Here you can see the trees that were actually fried in the blast um, floating around on the lake. It was unreal. All the trees melted and burned down and fell down off of those mudslides there into the lake, Spirit Lake, and now they are carried by the wind to either end of the lake. Just amazing to see the transition of everything coming back after all that. And emotionally, it was pretty neat to go back and climb back up there again.
Yeah, the changes are striking. That it's really it's nice to see nature regenerating where possible.
It really is, and the mountain goats are there, the elk are there, the there's one of my buddies. taken from a telephoto. But it's really neat to see the resilience of nature, and yes, it can come back. Sometimes on its own, like in this case, and sometimes with help, like Aldo Leopold showed us when he replanted and reestablished Wisconsin prairie, which at that time was a very radical idea to rescue a farm and bring it back to life again.
Now, Jeffrey, we have, I mentioned, a lot of librarians, and we have some great readers, including Betty Beckley, who had a library of uncountable books, many of which she donated to NCTC. So I think they might be interested in I think your most recent book called You Sold Your Book Where? Non-Traditional Marketing Strategies for Breakthrough Awareness and Book Sales. But really, this is part of that book, probably, and your earlier visit to NCTC, and you make some cogent points about um, the challenges and maybe opportunities of being an author. So you want to share just a little about that book, which I found pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, I when I first set out to do the Appalachian Odyssey book, I realized that I would love to incorporate the van and do a nationwide tour, which I was able to put together. And what I realized is you can't. I don't think it's realistic to depend entirely on any one channel anymore, even if you're professionally published. So I came up with the idea of, at least for me, of combining retail stores and bookstores and outdoor gear stores because it was an Appalachian Trail book, and making up some of it as I went along. My hope was to be able to find enough writing time to be able to work on my second book more than I actually was able to do. But it was pretty fun. I made some time in between appearances to try to get some writing time in, sometimes more successfully than others. But I also wanted to build in some time to go with the flow, which is important. Anyone who's hiked long distance or driven long distance knows that going with the flow is a skill or an adaptation that you really should have, especially if your van is 35 years old. Um, so I would stop at gear stores on my way through the first time and say, "Hey, would you like to do a book signing later on this year? I'll be swinging back through in October," that kind of thing. And so it was fun. And then the other thing I did, fortunately, was able to do right before I left was I decided to get that wrap that you saw in the van put on it, and on the back of it, I put my book cover, which ended up being a little bit of a stroke of genius slash luck. But I that's why I came up with the title "You Sold Your Book Where?" because I don't know too many authors that have sold books to gas station attendants on the New Jersey Turnpike at 4:30 in the morning, but there you go. Um, People would see the book, and it was phenomenal. I at a scenic overlook on Shenandoah on Skyline Drive. A couple from Britain bought the book to read on the plane on their way home, and I got a text message from someone in Sedona when I was leaving town. Please come back. I want to buy your book. It was very, very interesting to be able to travel around and have a side benefit.
Jeffrey Ryan may be the first nature writer to sell a book at the Vince Lombardi rest area on the Jersey Turnpike. That will be your claim to fame. I love it.
One of them.
One thing we haven't talked about as we wrap up here is you're also a blogger, and I saw on your website on Voices of the Wilderness you posted your top 10 blogs, and I just want to read a few because I think they give a sense of how useful and pragmatic they are. And then I'm going to question you on one of them. The top 10 blog posts include a state-by-state overview of the Appalachian Trail, how to section hike the Appalachian Trail, really useful stuff. How to buy hiking boots, 5 great trail hikes, uh, 3 lines of defense for insect-free hiking, how to load a backpack, bear-proofing your food in backcountry, best backpacking trails in all 50 states. These are all really pragmatic, but my favorite, because I've experienced it before, is a blog called Lost No More: How to Stay on the Trail and What to Do if you get off of it. Jeffrey, I have hiked sections of the trail and gotten lost, and I wish I'd had your advice. But for the audience out there, what's the best way not to get lost, and then when you do, like me, to find your way back to the AT or any other trail for that matter?
Wow, I'm so glad you asked that. I was thinking about that this afternoon, and I thought, boy, I hope he asked me that one. It's been one of my most read blogs, and
I
I
bet.
think what I've come to realize is there are 4 or 5 things that you need to be paying attention to when you're out in the outdoors, and they have to do with your mental state, your physical state, your water supply, your food supply. But the other piece of it is, am I paying attention to where I'm going? And believe it or not, all of us have a predilection for shutting the car door, getting on the trail, just walking into the woods, and then all of a sudden looking up and
Mhm.
saying, I don't know if I'm still on the trail or not. And it really is totally understandable because A, most of us aren't used to it, and B, we're so euphoric about being in the outdoors that we really stop paying attention to that detail, which I think is sort of like the red light coming on saying if your radiator is getting too hot, you just don't ignore it. You ignore it at your own peril. And I think it's true with just taking the time to make sure you're still on the trail. There are some places where you're just going to lose it because a tree with a blaze on it fell down in a storm or something. But it really is, it's easy to get lost. And the other thing is, it's easy to keep going once you are lost. It's easy to convince yourself that if I just keep going, I'll figure it out. And it's sort of like when you get a blister, you stop and take your boot off and look at it. You don't keep walking and hope that it gets better because it doesn't. And so I give some tips about that. It's really, to me, a couple of things. One is noticing things as you hike, noticing the terrain, macro view and micro view. So you remember features as you're hiking. If you get turned around, you'll remember that big rock that you saw the first time. If you're not really paying attention, then you're not apt to pick up on that. And then just the general awareness thing, and then always, as soon as you just feel like you might not know where that you're on trail for sure, just stop. I can't tell you how many times Wayne and I have yelled to each other. Do you see a blaze? Are you on the trail? It's over here. Where are you going? Come back, little Sheba, whatever. And it helps to go with someone, but it behooves you to just kind of check in and make sure you're on the right path.
Well, Jeffrey, you've been a great guide through hiking, through conservation history, through ecological restoration by nature. This has been really fun. But as we end, let me just throw out a little teaser for your newest film, Howard Zahniser, Champion of the Wilderness, and let folks know what they're in store for come 7 o'clock. Howard Zahniser, if you haven't heard of him, contributed mightily to the preservation of the Adirondacks, Dinosaur National Monument, and he was the major writer of the landmark National Wilderness Act of 1964. Yet, in spite of all these accomplishments, many haven't heard of him. And thanks to Jeffrey's film, we hope that's about to change. So, that film will start in about 15 minutes. And we'll thank Jeffrey again very much for giving us his time and his expertise and sharing his books with us. I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned into this broadcast from all around the country. That's been really a fun thing about this. And give a shout out to our very talented studio crew, Melissa Gonzalez, Rob Garfinkel, and Randy Robinson, who, if they weren't there, my microphone wouldn't work and all sorts of technical snafus would have happened. So we're very appreciative. So we're going to take a little intermission here. In about 14 minutes, we'll come back to this very same Facebook page. Please join us. And we'll have the NCTC premiere of Howard Zahniser film by Jeffrey. And Jeffrey will then come out and talk a little about the film and answer any questions you all might have.